I've done a video before talking about combining sentences effectively, but in this video we're going to talk about connecting separate sentences. So as we do this, we'll look at a bunch of examples, and the first ones will be more poetic and rhetorical, and then the last ones will be more practical in terms of actual essay writing. The first example here where we're starting to think about connecting sentences is from the Bible, and this is a very famous passage. It's particularly famous from Handel's Messiah, that famous musical composition. In this passage we have this rhetorical device that's called chiasmus. And the way chiasmus works is that the ideas are connected through repetition. But the repetition is kind of curious. So if you look at this section here, these three verses, we start with a concept, which is arise, okay? And then we're going to end with the same concept as well. So we have rising at the end. And then all of these repetitions work in the same way. So we have shining next, and then shining or brightness comes up at the end. Then we have light, okay, and we have light towards the end. We have glory, and we have glory here as well. Then we have this reference to the Lord is risen, and we also have a reference here, the Lord shall arise. And then at the very heart of the passage we have the darkness shall cover the earth, and gross darkness the people. And even within this passage, of course, there's these wonderful contrasts between light and darkness and so on. But what you can see now is that we have this elaborate kind of laddering effect where we start with A, right, concept A, then we have B and C, and then C again and B, and finally A. Of course, we have way more repetitions or versions than that, but you can sort of see the pattern here. That's a really poetic way to connect ideas, and of course I wouldn't expect you to do that in an essay, but it's maybe a nice way to start this discussion of how we can connect sentences in creative and interesting ways. Next, we'll have a look at a different rhetorical device, and this is more from the world of public speaking, although you could also use this in an essay in certain instances. And the rhetorical device we're talking about here is called Anaphora. So Anaphora, which sounds pretty fancy, comes from Greek, and the concept is actually fairly easy. In this case, what we have is we have multiple sentences that start the same way. And I'll let you read the passage yourself here, but you can see that after a while, Barack Obama starts repeating himself. He says, that's why, right, for the past 8 years, I've worked to put the fight against terrorism on a firm legal footing. That's why we've ended torture. I'm not sure that they've completely ended torture, but anyways, they've tried. That's why I rejected discrimination. That's why, right, and the passage keeps going. That's a really effective rhetorical technique, and I think if you go through Barack Obama's speeches, of course he's out of office now, but if you go through his speeches, you'll find that he's quite in love with Anaphora, as are many gifted speakers before him as well. And it just allows you to create that kind of momentum, a kind of crescendo, where your ideas gather momentum and they build up to something that seems quite formidable and fascinating. Anaphora is something you can use in academic writing, but I would use it quite sparingly and in very select situations. You generally don't need to give some kind of rousing oration in your essay. So again, Anaphora is more creative in terms of connecting ideas, but it is something to be aware of. Then we get a bit more practical here, and we're going to look at a couple of ways to effectively connect sentences. The first one is more of a kind of a minor suggestion, which is that often it's useful to pick up the end of a sentence and start your next sentence with that. But you don't want to overdo it. So if you look at this sentence here, it reads, the company's logo features an angry cicada. Okay. It's a nasty little bug. Well, it's not that nasty, but it's kind of big, and it makes this really loud buzzing noise. So what we've done here is in our second sentence, we've picked up the same idea. So we talk about the cicada again. Since the cicada is more often heard than seen, such a choice might seem ironic for a group of web developers. And this is quite effective where you just pick up the previous word and you keep going with it. But what you don't want to do, and this is probably the most important part of this advice, is you don't want to repeat too much. So if you say, for instance, the company's logo features an angry cicada, and then you say the company, or this choice by the company of having an angry cicada as part of its logo is, right? You can hear that there's way too much repetition there. And so we want to make sure that if we do pick up the previous idea and keep going, that we don't repeat too much, that we repeat quite sparingly. Okay, then we get to our last example here, and this is probably the most important one, because this one deals with connecting words, transitional words, as they're often called, and many of these transitional words are conjunctive adverbs. Conjunctive adverbs. Now, we have a separate page about conjunctive adverbs on the website, and it's definitely worthwhile to check that out to see what kinds of options you have there for picking the right word. But conjunctive adverbs are often very useful in connecting ideas and sentences. The problem with them, though, if you consider this a problem, is that some of them seem a bit heavy-handed. And in this case, however, can seem like it's a bit stilted, a bit wooden. Maybe you don't want that. Maybe you want something different. In that case, you would be well off to start thinking about synonyms for these conjunctive adverbs. And if you think about however, there are quite a few options that are out there. You could say, for instance, on the other hand. Okay, on the other hand. But that sounds pretty formal too, doesn't it? On the other hand, or on the one hand, and it takes up a lot of room. You could also go with a lower kind of register in terms of your tone. You could cross this out and you could say something like, interest rates remain quite low, though. Now that sounds a bit more casual, in fact maybe too casual, so maybe you don't want that. There are other options. If you don't want though, then instead of however, you can often use yet, and yet just brings the tone into an area where it's just a little bit more casual. It speeds up the sentence a bit, allows you to make that transition. Yet, of course, is also a coordinating conjunction, so you can actually use it at the end of the previous sentence after a comma, and then you can just combine the two sentences quite easily. But you can also start a sentence with it. That's not incorrect, so that would be fine as well. You can also use other synonyms, so you can use still, for instance. I guess these are not perfect synonyms, but they are quite similar. You can say at the same time. A bit more wordy. Oops, at the same time. It's a bit more wordy, but maybe it's less obtrusive. And that's really the key here with these kinds of transitional expressions. You don't want them to be too obvious all the time, because if your whole paragraph is, however, moreover, thus, in addition, eventually the reader is going to be like, okay, this person has no idea of how to make transitions kind of smooth and easy. And that is something you want to do. So I would really encourage you then to think of these kinds of other ways of saying the same thing, and bring the register down a little bit, or make it more casual at times to make the flow smoother. The other thing you can do is to take this conjunctive adverb and just move it a bit further into the sentence, and that makes it less conspicuous as well. So you could say something like, interest rates, however, remain quite low, and that can be an effective strategy as well. So really go through those conjunctive adverbs and start to think about how you can vary them, how you can find variations for the same ones. Another constellation or another group that I can mention here would be something like therefore, right? If you have therefore, then other ones that would relate to this would be thus, and as a result, which is a bit wordy perhaps, then. So then can be quite effective. You could say something like, it appears then, or we see then. And that's a little bit less obtrusive or conspicuous than therefore, right? And you can start to see now that these constellations do exist, that you have quite a few words that do the same kind of thing. And as a writer, it really pays off to start to be aware of which words kind of go together, and how you can vary them in your writing. Last piece of advice, if you can do without the conjunction, the conjunctive adverb, that's sometimes even better, because then your connection is more implicit, and that might be a really pleasing effect. So what you could do then, for instance, is use a semicolon to connect your ideas, and then that semicolon stands in for a conjunction and creates the connection kind of more implicitly. So that's another way to do it. Okay, that's it for connecting sentences. Hopefully you find this useful.